The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Opera House sparkled like a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Everyone who was anyone in the city had come to this charity gala. The event was raising money for children's hospitals, and the ticket prices alone could have fed a small town for a month. Alexander Sterling stood near the bar, swirling his expensive whiskey. At 32, he owned 3 tech companies and had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His sharp black suit was custom-made, and his watch cost more than most people's cars. But what really set him apart was his attitude. Alexander believed his wealth made him better than everyone else, and he wasn't shy about showing it. "Did you see the mayor trying to get my attention earlier?" Alexander said to his friend David, who owned a chain of luxury hotels. "He practically begged me to fund his new project. These people are so predictable." David nodded, though he sometimes felt uncomfortable with Alexander's arrogance. They had grown up together, but success had changed his old friend in ways that weren't always pleasant. The evening had been going perfectly according to plan. Rich people writing big checks, politicians making speeches about helping others, and everyone pretending they cared about more than just being seen at the right event. Alexander loved these gatherings because they reminded him of his power and status. Then disaster struck. The event's main entertainment was supposed to be a famous pianist who would perform during dinner. But just as the guests were being seated, the event coordinator rushed onto the small stage looking panicked. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice shaking slightly, "I'm afraid our pianist has fallen ill and cannot perform tonight. We're trying to find a replacement, but—" Murmurs of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Alexander rolled his eyes. "Typical," he muttered. "These people can't organize anything properly." The coordinator looked desperately around the room. "If anyone knows someone who could play, even just background music, please let us know immediately." For several minutes, chaos reigned. People pulled out their phones, making calls to friends who might know musicians. The coordinator had clearly been crying in the kitchen, and the event was falling apart. That's when she appeared. A young woman walked quietly toward the stage. She wore a simple black dress, not designer, not expensive, just plain black fabric that looked like it came from a regular store. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. Most people didn't even notice her approaching the piano. Alexander noticed, though. He noticed because something about her seemed out of place. She didn't belong with the glittering crowd of millionaires and socialites. She looked like she worked here, maybe serving drinks or cleaning tables. "What's that girl doing?" Alexander asked David, pointing with his whiskey glass. The woman spoke briefly to the coordinator, who looked surprised and hopeful. Then she sat down at the grand piano that had been sitting silent and ignored all evening. Alexander couldn't help himself. The situation was too perfect, too ridiculous. Here was some random staff member thinking she could save the day. He had to say something. "This should be entertaining," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. His voice carried that particular tone wealthy people use when they're about to make fun of someone. "I'll marry you if you can actually play something worthwhile." Laughter erupted from the surrounding tables. People turned to look, first at Alexander, then at the young woman at the piano. Some guests pulled out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing disaster. The woman looked up from the piano bench. For just a moment, her eyes met Alexander's across the room. He expected to see embarrassment, maybe anger. Instead, he saw something that made him suddenly uncomfortable. A look of calm determination, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. She turned back to the piano without saying a word. The room fell silent as she placed her hands on the keys. Alexander smirked, waiting for the amateur fumbling that would justify his mockery. David shifted uncomfortably beside him, already regretting his friend's loud comment. Then she began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom like liquid gold. Not the simple melody most people would attempt, but one of the most challenging pieces in classical music. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace and precision. Alexander's smirk disappeared. The music wasn't just technically perfect, it was breathtaking. Every note seemed to carry emotion that reached into the chest of everyone listening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Waiters froze with trays in their hands. Even the kitchen staff crept out to listen. Alexander felt his face growing hot. The laughter from his table had died completely. Now people were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to disapproval. He had just publicly mocked what was clearly a professional musician of extraordinary talent. The woman played for nearly 15 minutes, transitioning seamlessly between pieces. Chopin, Debussy, Mozart, each one performed with the skill of someone who had spent decades mastering their craft. The room was completely under her spell. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence lasted for several heartbeats. Then applause exploded through the ballroom. People stood up cheering and clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Several guests had tears in their eyes. Alexander remained seated, his whiskey forgotten in his hand. He felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Around him, his table companions were applauding, but he could feel their sideways glances. His thoughtless comment had made him look like a fool in front of the most important people in the city. The woman stood gracefully and gave a small bow to the audience. She didn't look toward Alexander's table, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Instead, she quietly walked off the stage and disappeared toward the kitchen area. "Well," David said carefully, "that was unexpected." Alexander said nothing. He was still processing what had just happened. The confident mockery he had felt just minutes ago had transformed into something he rarely experienced: genuine embarrassment. Throughout the rest of the dinner, people kept talking about the mysterious pianist. Who was she? Where had she learned to play like that? Why was she working at a catering event instead of performing at concert halls around the world? Alexander tried to focus on his meal, but the questions kept circling in his mind too. More importantly, he couldn't stop thinking about that moment when she had looked at him. There had been no fear in her eyes, no desperate need for his approval. She had simply looked at him like he was just another person, and somehow that bothered him more than anything else. By the end of the evening, Alexander Sterling, a man who had never apologized for anything in his adult life, found himself wondering if he should try to find the woman and say he was sorry. The problem was he had no idea who she was or how to find her. And for the first time in years, Alexander Sterling realized that his money and status might not be enough to fix the mess he had created. 3 days had passed since the charity gala, but Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the woman at the piano. He had tried everything to get her out of his mind, working late, going to expensive restaurants, even buying a new car. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear that incredible music and see her calm, determined face. The worst part was how everyone kept talking about it. At the office, his employees whispered about the mystery pianist when they thought he couldn't hear. His friend David had called twice to ask if he had found out who she was. Even his housekeeper had mentioned seeing a video of the performance on social media. Alexander Sterling was not used to being the subject of gossip, especially not the embarrassing kind. On Wednesday morning, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of sending his assistant to do research like he usually did, Alexander personally called the event planning company that had organized the gala. "I need to know about the woman who played piano at Monday's event," he told the coordinator, a frazzled woman named Patricia who clearly remembered him. "Oh, you mean Elena," Patricia said, her voice becoming noticeably cooler. "Elena Rossi. She's one of our part-time servers. I had no idea she could play like that until she volunteered to help." Elena Rossi. Finally, a name. "I'd like to speak with her," Alexander said. "Could you give me her contact information?" There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but I can't give out personal information about our employees. Company policy." Alexander felt his familiar irritation rising. People didn't usually tell him no. "I could make it worth your while," he said, his voice taking on that edge that usually made people cooperate. "I'm sure you could," Patricia replied firmly. "But the answer is still no. If you'd like to leave a message, I can pass it along to her." After hanging up, Alexander sat in his office staring out at the city skyline. He could have his private investigator find Elena Rossi within hours. He could use his connections and influence to track down everything about her. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of how she had looked at him that night. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable realization that he was already acting like the kind of man his own mother would have been ashamed of. Instead, he did something completely out of character. He waited. 2 days later, Patricia called him back. "Elena said she'll meet with you," she said, sounding surprised. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock at Café Luna on 5th Street. She chose the place." Alexander had never heard of Café Luna, which should have been his first clue. The next afternoon, he walked into what was clearly a neighborhood coffee shop. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers, just mismatched chairs, local artwork on the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee and homemade pastries. Alexander felt completely out of place in his $1,000 suit. Elena was already there, sitting at a small table near the window. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than she had that night at the gala, but there was still something serious in her dark eyes. "Thank you for coming," Alexander said as he sat down across from her. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head dozens of times, but now that he was here, all his prepared words seemed wrong. "I almost didn't," Elena replied quietly. "But I was curious about what you wanted to say." A waitress came over, a teenage girl with bright purple streaks in her hair who clearly knew Elena well. "The usual?" she asked. "Please." "And whatever." "He's having." Elena gestured toward Alexander. "Just coffee," Alexander said, feeling awkward. He wasn't used to places where the staff treated customers like family friends. When they were alone again, Alexander took a deep breath. "I want to apologize," he said. "What I said at the gala was thoughtless and cruel. I was showing off and I embarrassed you in front of everyone." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "You embarrassed yourself more than me," she said finally. "I'm used to people underestimating me." "You shouldn't have to be." She shrugged. "It's the world we live in. People see a young woman in simple clothes and assume she can't do anything important." The waitress brought their drinks. Elena's coffee came with what looked like homemade whipped cream and cinnamon. Alexander's was just black coffee in a chipped mug. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Alexander asked. "That wasn't amateur level. That was professional," Elena finished. "Because I am. Or was." She wrapped her hands around her mug, as if seeking warmth. "I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old. By the time I was 12, I was performing with symphony orchestras. At 16, I was accepted to Juilliard." Alexander felt his assumption crumbling. "Then why were you working as a server?" Elena's expression became guarded. "Life happened. Sometimes you have to make choices between what you want and what your family needs." She didn't elaborate, and Alexander sensed he shouldn't push. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about her story. "Do you miss it? Performing professionally?" "Every day," she said simply. "But missing something and being able to do something about it are different things." They talked for over an hour. Alexander learned that Elena lived in a small apartment with her younger brother, that she worked 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet, and that she still practiced piano whenever she could find access to one. What he didn't learn was why she had given up her career, or why someone with her talent was struggling financially. As they prepared to leave, Alexander made an impulsive decision. "Let me help you," he said. "I could arrange auditions or fund your return to performing or—" Elena stood up, and for the first time he saw a flash of anger in her eyes. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Sterling. I agreed to meet with you because I thought you wanted to apologize, not because I wanted your money." "That's not what I meant," Alexander protested, but she was already walking toward the door. "Yes, it was," she said over her shoulder. "It's what men like you always mean." Alexander sat alone at the small table, feeling worse than he had before. The meeting. Everything he touched seemed to turn into a disaster. But as he looked around the cozy cafe, he noticed something. This place felt real in a way his world didn't. The conversations at other tables were genuine, the laughter was unforced, and the teenage waitress was humming while she wiped down tables. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found himself thinking about Elena Rossi constantly. But more than that, he started thinking about the things she had said, about people underestimating her, about making choices between what you want and what your family needs, about the difference between missing something and being able to do something about it. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling began to wonder if having unlimited money might actually be limiting his understanding of how the world really worked. He also started doing something he had never done before. He began researching Elena Rossi, not to use the information against her, but to understand her story. What he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about sacrifice, family, and what it really meant to be wealthy. Alexander couldn't get Elena out of his mind. It had been 2 weeks since their awkward meeting at Café Luna, and he found himself driving past that neighborhood more often than he cared to admit. He told himself he was just curious about that part of the city, but deep down he knew he was hoping to catch another glimpse of her. His research had led him down a rabbit hole he never expected. Elena Rossi had been a child prodigy, just like she said. He found old newspaper articles about her performances, videos of her playing with major orchestras when she was barely a teenager. The critics had called her a once-in-a-generation talent and the future of classical music. Then, about 5 years ago, she had simply vanished from the music world. No farewell concerts, no announcement, no explanation. One day she was being featured in music magazines, and the next day it was like she had never existed. Alexander had enough money and connections to dig deeper, but something stopped him. Every time he reached for his phone to call his private investigator, he remembered the look in Elena's eyes when she had accused him of offering charity. Maybe some stories weren't his to uncover. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He started visiting the neighborhood where Café Luna was located. It wasn't the kind of place Alexander Sterling usually went. The buildings were older, the restaurant served food he couldn't pronounce, and people actually walked places instead of being driven in expensive cars. But there was something about this area that drew him in. It felt alive in a way his usual haunts didn't. His third visit to the neighborhood, he discovered something interesting. There was a small community center just 2 blocks from Café Luna, and according to the schedule posted outside, they hosted live music every Friday night. Local musicians mostly, playing for crowds of maybe 30 or 40 people. Alexander almost didn't go in. He stood outside the community center for 10 minutes, feeling ridiculous in his expensive suit among people wearing jeans and casual clothes. But curiosity won out over embarrassment. The performance space was just a large room with folding chairs and a small stage that looked like it had been built by volunteers. Alexander found a seat in the back and tried to blend in, which was impossible, given that his watch probably cost more than most people there made in a year. Then Elena walked onto the stage. She was wearing the same jeans and sweater from their coffee meeting, and she looked completely at home in this simple setting. When she sat down at the old upright piano, the small crowd grew quiet with anticipation. Clearly, she was a regular here. "Good evening, everyone," she said into the microphone, her voice warm and relaxed. "I thought tonight we'd try something a little different. This piece was written by a friend of mine who couldn't be here tonight, but he wanted to share his music with all of you." What followed was 15 minutes of the most beautiful music Alexander had ever heard. Not classical, this time, but something modern and emotional that seemed to tell a story without words. Elena played with the same incredible skill she had shown at the gala, but here she looked happy, free. When she finished, the applause was enthusiastic but not overwhelming. People called out compliments like they knew her personally. "Beautiful. As always, Elena," someone shouted. "Your brother would be proud," called another voice. Alexander felt like he was intruding on something private. This wasn't a performance for strangers. It was Elena sharing her gift with people who cared about her as a person, not just as an entertainer. After the show, Elena mingled with the crowd, hugging people and chatting about their lives. Alexander watched from his corner, fascinated by this side of her personality. She was laughing and relaxed, completely different from the guarded woman he had met at the cafe. He was preparing to leave when she noticed him. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Elena looked startled. Then her expression became unreadable. She said something to the person she was talking with and walked over to where Alexander was standing. "Following me now, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, but her tone was more curious than angry. "I was exploring the neighborhood," Alexander said, which was technically true. "I had no idea you played here." Elena studied his face, probably trying to decide whether to believe him. "This isn't exactly your scene," she observed. "No," Alexander admitted. "But maybe it should be." Something in his voice must have convinced her that he was being sincere, because her defensive posture relaxed slightly. "The music was beautiful tonight," he continued. "Different from what you played at the gala, but just as—" "Thank you." Elena glanced around the emptying room. "This place means a lot to me. These people accepted me when I needed a place to belong." "Why did you need a place to belong?" Alexander asked gently. "What happened 5 years ago?" Elena's walls went back up immediately. "That's not your business." "You're right," Alexander said quickly. "I'm sorry, I keep wondering about your story." They walked outside together, the cool evening air a relief after the warm community center. Elena seemed to be debating something internally. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course." "Why do you care? Really, you're a billionaire with more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. You could have any kind of entertainment you want. Why are you here in a neighborhood community center asking about my life?" It was a fair question and one Alexander had been asking himself. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Something about that night at the gala, it changed something for me. I've been thinking about the things you said, about people underestimating you, about making choices between what you want and what your family needs." Elena looked surprised. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything about that conversation." Alexander surprised himself with his honesty. "I've been thinking about how I've never had to make those kinds of choices. I've never had to choose between my dreams and my family's needs because I've always had enough money for both." They had reached the corner where their paths would diverge. Elena lived somewhere in this neighborhood, while Alexander's driver was waiting 3 blocks away with his car. "My brother needed surgery," Elena said suddenly. 5 years ago. Experimental surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. It cost everything I had saved plus money I didn't have. I had to give up my career to take care of him and work enough jobs to pay the medical bills." Alexander felt like he had been punched in the chest. "Is he okay now?" "He's alive," Elena said. "The surgery worked, but he needs ongoing treatment. Expensive ongoing treatment." "Elena, I could help. I could pay for his treatments, and you could return to your career." "No." Her voice was firm but not angry. "I told you before, I don't want your charity. It wouldn't be charity. You're incredibly talented. It would be an investment." "In what?" "In me being grateful to you? In me owing you something?" Elena shook her head. "I've seen how men like you operate, Mr. Sterling. Everything comes with strings attached." Alexander wanted to argue, to explain, that his offer was genuine, but he realized she was probably right to be suspicious. How many times had he used his wealth to control situations and people? "What if there were no strings?" he asked. "What if I just wanted to help because it's the right thing to do?" Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Men like you don't do things just because they're right. You do them because they benefit you somehow." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone on the street corner, wondering when he had become the kind of man that people automatically distrusted. But as he walked back to his car, Alexander realized something important had just happened. For the first time in his adult life, someone had refused his money not because they didn't need it, but because they didn't trust his motives. And the worst part was, Elena was probably right to feel that way. Alexander's world came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in October. He was sitting in his corner office reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant burst through the door without knocking. Her face was pale, and she was holding a tablet with shaking hands. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," she said, setting the tablet on his desk. The headline made Alexander's blood run cold. Sterling Tech under investigation for data privacy violations. Below it was a smaller headline that was even worse. Hostile takeover attempt by Blackstone Industries expected within days. Alexander grabbed the tablet and read quickly. Someone had leaked internal documents suggesting that his company had been collecting user data without proper consent. The leak had triggered a federal investigation and caused his stock price to plummet by 40% overnight. But the data collection allegations weren't even the worst part. The real disaster was that Richard Blackstone, his biggest business rival, was using the chaos to launch a hostile takeover of Sterling Tech. Blackstone had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. "Get me the legal team," Alexander snapped, "and call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon." Over the next 3 days, Alexander barely slept. His lawyers worked around the clock to respond to the federal investigation while his financial team tried to prevent the takeover. The media coverage was brutal, with reporters camping outside his office building and his house. Alexander had faced business challenges before, but nothing like this. Everything he had built over the past decade was at risk. The companies his father had left him, the empire he had expanded, the reputation that opened doors wherever he went. All of it was hanging by a thread. The worst part was the isolation. Business associates who had been calling him daily suddenly stopped returning his calls. Invitations to exclusive events dried up. Even some of his employees were updating their resumes and looking for new jobs. In the middle of this crisis, Alexander found himself thinking about Elena more than ever. During sleepless nights in his office, he would remember their conversations and wonder what she would think of his situation. Would she feel sorry for him? Or would she see this as justice for a man who had always believed his wealth made him untouchable? By Friday, Alexander was desperate. The hostile takeover was moving forward, and his lawyers had informed him that fighting it would require tactics that existed in legal gray areas. They could probably save his company, but only by doing things that would destroy other people's livelihoods and potentially break laws. "We can make this problem go away," his head lawyer told him during an emergency meeting. "But you'll need to authorize some actions that might not look good if they ever became public." Alexander stared out his office window at the city below. A month ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. Business was war, and in war you did whatever it took to win. But now, sitting in his expensive chair wearing his $1,000 suit, he heard Elena's voice in his head. "Men like you don't do things just because they're right. You do them because they benefit you somehow." "What kind of actions?" Alexander asked quietly. His lawyer outlined a plan that would involve spreading false rumors about Blackstone's financial stability, bribing key investors to switch sides, and using private investigators to dig up dirt on Blackstone's personal life. All of it was technically legal, but morally questionable at best. "This will work," the lawyer assured him. "Blackstone won't know what hit him, but we need to move fast." Alexander closed his eyes. This was exactly the kind of ruthless behavior that had built his empire. His father had taught him that nice guys finished last in the business world, and he had lived by that philosophy his entire adult life. But something had changed. Over the past month, he had started seeing himself through Elena's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. She had refused his help because she didn't trust his motives, and she had been right not to. Everything he did was calculated to benefit himself somehow. "Sir?" the lawyer prompted. "We need your authorization to proceed." Alexander opened his eyes and looked around the room at his team of lawyers and advisors. These people had helped him build his fortune, but they had also helped him become the kind of man that people like Elena automatically distrusted. "No," Alexander said quietly. "Excuse me?" The lawyer looked confused. "I said no. We're not doing any of that." The room erupted in protests. His advisors argued that he was making an emotional decision that would destroy everything he had worked for. His lawyers warned him that Blackstone wouldn't hesitate to use dirty tactics against him. "Then let him." Alexander said, standing up. I'm not going to save my company by destroying my integrity. After everyone left, Alexander sat alone in his office as the sun set over the city. He had just made a decision that would probably cost him billions of dollars and years of work. But for the first time in months, he felt like he could look at himself in the mirror. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David, his old friend. Saw the news. Are you okay? Alexander started to type back that he was fine, that everything was under control. But then he stopped and wrote the truth instead. No, I'm probably about to lose everything, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. The weekend was surreal. Alexander's house felt enormous and empty. His housekeeper kept asking if he wanted her to prepare meals, but he had no appetite. He spent most of Saturday walking around his property, looking at all the expensive things he had accumulated over the years. On Sunday evening, he did something he hadn't done in months. He drove to Elena's neighborhood. He didn't have a plan. He just needed to be somewhere that felt real, somewhere that reminded him that there was more to life than quarterly profits and stock prices. He parked near Cafe Luna and walked the streets, where he had first started questioning his assumptions about the world. The community center was dark, no Friday night performance to draw him in. But as he walked past Elena's building, he saw a light in what he assumed was her apartment window. For a moment, he considered going up and telling her what was happening. She had been right about him, and part of him wanted her to know that he was finally trying to change. But he didn't knock on her door. Instead, he sat on a bench across the street and thought about the choices he had made over the past week. Choosing honesty over victory, choosing integrity over wealth, choosing to become the kind of man Elena might actually trust, even if she never gave him the chance to prove it. On Monday morning, Alexander returned to his office to face whatever consequences his decisions had brought. His stock price had fallen another 20% over the weekend, and Blackstone's takeover was moving forward faster than ever. But as Alexander sat in his chair, looking out at the city where somewhere Elena was probably getting ready for another day of working multiple jobs to support her brother, he realized something important. For the first time in his adult life, he was more concerned about being a good person than being a successful businessman. And regardless of what happened to his company, that felt like a victory worth celebrating. 3 weeks after Alexander's world began falling apart, something unexpected happened. He was sitting in his nearly empty office. Half his staff had already been laid off, when his assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Elena Rossi. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Alexander's heart jumped. He hadn't seen Elena since that night outside the community center, though he had thought about her every day during the crisis. "Send her in." Elena walked into his office wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a newspaper. She looked around, at the boxes of personal items Alexander had been packing, the empty bookshelves, and the general air of defeat that hung over everything. "So it's true," she said quietly. "You're really losing everything." "Pretty much," Alexander admitted. "The takeover goes through next week. I'll probably keep a small office somewhere, but Sterling Tech as I built it will be gone." Elena sat down across from his desk and placed the newspaper in front of him. It was folded to an article titled, "The Billionaire Who Chose Honesty Over Victory." "I read this piece about what happened," she said. "About how you refused to use dirty tactics to save your company. About how you chose to fight fair even when you knew you'd lose." Alexander glanced at the article. "I'm surprised anyone noticed. Most of the coverage has been about my failures, not my principles." This reporter noticed. "She interviewed some of your employees, your competitors, even your lawyers. They all said the same thing, that you could have saved everything if you'd been willing to play dirty, but you chose not to." "And what do you think about that?" Alexander asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I think I misjudged you," she said finally. "When we first met, I assumed you were just another rich man trying to buy whatever he wanted. I thought your interest in me was just another acquisition." "Maybe it was at first," Alexander said honestly. "I'm not sure I knew the difference between genuine interest and wanting to possess something. But you do now." Alexander looked out his office window at the city below. In a few days, this view wouldn't be his anymore. I think so. I hope so. Elena leaned forward in her chair. There's something else I need to tell you. Last week, I got a call from Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. They offered me a position as their featured pianist, a full-time job with benefits playing the music I love. Alexander felt a mix of joy and sadness. That's wonderful. You deserve that opportunity. I turned it down. What? Why? Elena smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was completely unguarded. Because something better came along. A music producer who heard me play at the community center offered me a recording contract. Not just performing other people's music, but recording my own compositions. Music that means something to me. Elena, that's incredible. The advance isn't huge, she continued, but it's enough to cover my brother's treatments for the next 2 years. And if the album does well, it could lead to more opportunities. Alexander felt genuinely happy for her, without any of the complicated emotions he might have expected. When do you start recording? Next month. But first I wanted to ask you something. Elena took a deep breath. Would you like to come to my final performance at the community center this Friday? I'm playing a piece I wrote. It's called The Man Who Learned to Fall. Alexander couldn't help but smile. That's either very flattering or very insulting. It's about someone who had everything but didn't know what anything was worth until he lost it, Elena said. About learning that falling down isn't the same as failing. Friday night, Alexander walked into the community center wearing jeans and a simple sweater, clothes he had bought just for this occasion. He felt strange without his expensive suits, but also somehow lighter. The small performance space was packed. Word had gotten out about Elena's recording contract, and the neighborhood had turned out to celebrate one of their own. Alexander found a seat in the back, just like the first time he'd come here. When Elena took the stage, she looked radiant. The stress and guardedness that had always shadowed her face were gone, replaced by pure joy. Good evening, everyone, she said into the microphone. Tonight is my last performance here before I start my recording career, and I wanted to share something special with all of you. This piece is about second chances, about learning that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what really matters. The music that followed was unlike anything Alexander had ever heard. It was complex and beautiful, but also deeply emotional. It told a story of pride and fall, of loss and redemption, of finding truth in unexpected places. As Elena played, Alexander felt like she was telling his story, but also her own, and somehow the story of everyone who had ever had to choose between what they wanted and what was right. When the last note faded, the applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, cheering and wiping away tears. Alexander found himself clapping harder than he had ever clapped for anything. After the performance, Elena made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and hugs. When she reached Alexander, they looked at each other for a long moment. Thank you, Alexander said simply. For what? For showing me who I could be instead of just who I was. Elena smiled. You did that yourself. I just refused to let you buy your way out of becoming a better person. They walked outside together into the cool night air. Alexander's driver wasn't waiting this time. He had sold the car and let his driver go with a generous severance package. So what happens now? Elena asked. What does Alexander Sterling do when he's not running a billion-dollar company? I'm not sure yet, Alexander admitted. I've been thinking about teaching, maybe. Business ethics at a university. Helping young entrepreneurs understand that how you build something matters as much as what you build. That sounds perfect for Yasu. They reached the corner where their paths diverged. Elena was heading home to pack for her move to a recording studio in Nashville. Alexander was walking to the small apartment he had rented in this same neighborhood, the first place he had ever lived that felt like home instead of just an address. Elena, Alexander said as she turned to leave. I know you said you don't want my charity, and I respect that. But I want you to know that watching you choose your dreams while still taking care of your family, it taught me what real wealth looks like. Elena stepped closer and, to Alexander's surprise, gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek. "You know," she said softly, "when you first said you'd marry me if I could play, you were joking. But if you had asked me tonight, after everything that's happened, after watching you choose integrity over everything else, I might have said yes." With that, she walked away, leaving Alexander standing on the street corner with a smile on, his face and hope in his heart for the first time in months. 6 months later, Alexander's small business ethics consulting firm was thriving. Elena's album had hit the top of the classical music charts, and they were both discovering that the best things in life really couldn't be bought. They could only be earned through becoming worthy of them.